The super rich are self-made, so if you're broke, it's not your parents' fault, it's your own. Sorry to break it to you, but only 1/5 of millionaires were handed wealth by their parents. As for billionaires, a study by the American Economic Association looked into the Forbes 400 list to discover that only 32% belonged to very rich families. That means if you're under 30 and have $1 billion in the bank, then you definitely got it from mum and dad. But either way, it doesn't matter, because by the time your great-grandkids get hold of their inheritance, your gene pool will have gone from rags to riches and back again. Or at least that's the proverb, rags to rags in 3 generations. Maybe you've heard a version with short sleeves or clogs or something similar, but if not, don't worry. You probably know an example in your own life of a time when a family became wealthy only to lose it all by the 3rd generation. The idea is the first generation works hard to gain wealth, the second generation works hard to maintain wealth, and the 3rd generation works hard to spend wealth. But some versions have it that the reason the grandkids end up with nothing is because it was their parents, the original heirs to the fortune, who didn't share the same values as their entrepreneurial forebears. Surely the proverb isn't that true though. Surely we just want it to be true because it feeds into our natural sense of jealousy and inequality. After all, business dynasties like Trump and Rockefeller aren't going away anytime soon. If anything, they're getting richer. And the nepo babies of Hollywood prove you don't need looks or talent to become a successful model or actor, just a dad who was once in a rock band. Before, a business could only survive on its family name if it was a law firm, accountancy office, or funeral directors. Nowadays, the family name is kept off the branding and locked in the boardroom. Rupert Murdoch's vast media empire recently lined up his son to take over, and the makers of M&Ms and Snickers are making sure the levers of power are in the hands of the Mars family. Look at Goldman Sachs and the Lehman Brothers. Both started as family-run before growing into towering behemoths. They certainly survived past the 3rd generation. Granted, Lehman Brothers went down in the 2008 financial collapse, but their rags-to-rags journey took 174 years. So, is there a strategy to sustain family wealth? Or is this just survivorship bias? How do some families ride out economic forces and shifts in society to ensure that future generations still have their family fortunes? Who were the families that first jumped the gap between the have and have-nots? They were the merchants of Florence, and they made Silicon Valley look like a lemonade stand. These families were like a mix between Succession and Game of Thrones, where only one name would emerge victorious. They were so successful that research into their tax records proved how their descendants remained wealthy 600 years later. 3 of the top 4 families during the 1400s are still in the top 10% of earners today. That means these fortunes survived more than 3 generations. They survived war, inflation, and sabotage. But how much generational wealth was down to business acumen and market changes, and how much was to do with politics, art, and religion? And what lessons do they leave for their modern-day equivalents? It's time to learn how history works as we trace the family fortunes that lasted over 600 years. Today's episode is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is the go-to platform for anyone looking to truly understand and apply complex subjects. With thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, and technology, it's designed to make learning both fun and effective. I'm particularly excited about their new How LLMs Work course. This course takes you inside the mechanics of language models, exploring how they learn and generate text. Whether you're curious about AI or considering a career in tech, this course gives you hands-on experience with one of today's most powerful tools. I've been exploring this course myself, and it's fascinating to see how different models work and how you can tune them for various tasks. From writing poetry to drafting professional emails. Brilliant makes complex topics like this accessible, even if you're new to the subject. And the best part? You can learn at your own pace, fitting Brilliant's interactive lessons into your daily life, whether you have 5 minutes or an hour to spare. To explore everything Brilliant has to offer, including their new How LLMs Work course, for free for 30 days, head over to brilliant.org/howhistoryworks, or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. It's never been easy to make money. For most of history, markets have been small. Even when a civilization established a financial system and currency, wealth wasn't the main path to power. Ruling came down to land ownership and the loyal soldiers willing to defend it, so your family fortune was only as strong as your army. And even if you didn't have the coin to buy loyalty, there would still be serfs and slaves to keep your empire ticking over. It wasn't until the emergence of guilds and independent merchants that the influence of royal heirs began to wane. As society shifted away from a strict communal structure, individuals could hone skills and talents to convert into a day's wage. Markets emerged, and our modern groundwork was laid down. Unfortunately, the chance of a peasant becoming a noble was still lower than making money through a multi-level marketing scheme. Compare that to the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. For the first real time in human history, it was conceivable that someone with nothing could build generational wealth. Until the steam engine, practically the only way to be rich was to be born rich. As society and culture shifted from agriculture to industrial production in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were more ways to make money, but there were also more ways to lose money. That's not the worst thing though. As Andrew Carnegie once said, the man who dies rich dies disgraced. But maybe that's what a broke YouTube voiceover artist would say. Anyway, the line from guilds to production wasn't a straight one. Before the trade routes of the Age of Discovery, it wasn't clear how an outsider could buy their way into power. The medieval system of lords and monarchs was rigid and protected. Society and culture were inflexible. But then, one place became the heart of trading, the Republic of Florence, Italy. The city became a hotspot due to a combination of strategic factors. For example, being in Tuscany meant the city was at the intersection of major trade routes between Northern Europe and the Mediterranean. Plus, its access to the Arno River tied it to the ports near Pisa, allowing them to reach ports all around the Mediterranean. Florence had a prominent reputation for crafters and artisans, which gave way to a booming textile industry. Wools and silks were refined in Florence before being shipped to rich clients across Europe. As trade grew, so did the banks and financial institutions. In time, artists were also attracted to the city, which grew its cultural influence and expanded the goods being produced and shipped from the city. At the centre of all of this was a group of families competing for dominance, not just in market share, but also in political power, where enemies were exiled and traitors were executed. There were the Strozzi, patrons of the arts and responsible for building the Palazzo Strozzi, one of Florence's most iconic Renaissance-era palaces. The ambitious Pitti family were prominent during the 15th century, and their Palazzo Pitti is now a major museum. The Rucellai started as wool merchants but became bankers, renowned for their architectural and artistic patronage. The Tornabuoni were so influential in finance and art, but gained a lot of their political influence through marriage. Then there were the Albezzi, the original power family before the 14th century, and the Pazzis, who gambled wealth and power to stab their friends in the back. But the one family that came out on top were the Medici, easily the most famous and prominent family throughout Florence's heyday. Their legacy and fortune has lasted centuries. Most of their power and fame was acquired through banking and philanthropy, especially during the height of the Renaissance. Their power play sustained a family tree with such deep roots that it produced 2 popes, 2 queens, and, indirectly at least, the statue of David. That's a pretty impressive result for a family that almost faded away into nothing. So how did they grow their fortune? It starts with Cosimo de' Medici receiving an inheritance from his father, Giovanni, a banker and trader who had made a more than modest life for himself when he turned his own paltry inheritance into a fortune. But Cosimo wasn't going to reinvest in his family's namesake like his forebears, at least not in the same way everyone else did. Sure, it was still 100 or so years before the likes of the East India Trading Company, but power was slowly shifting towards trade. The medieval period was ending. Change was coming. Cosimo could have played it safe by maintaining his family's respectable business, but how long would that have lasted? Cosimo was the second generation of financiers, so if he got complacent, then, well, his legacy wouldn't last long. He knew a few savvy moves would secure his family name and family fortune. First, he continued to leverage the Medici bank branches and partnerships set up in cities all over Europe. This was a huge risk given how slow communication was back then. Plus, the wars of Europe meant instability. But where others saw risk, Cosimo saw opportunity. By having banks close to big clients, he could service the wealthiest customers to make the most money. He left the smaller fish to his competition while he brokered his big break with the Vatican. His own branch manager in Rome was part of the papacy and even managed the church's finances. In return for a commission, of course. Saving your soul is one thing, but everyone still has bills to pay. Together they created a system where even the most far-flung branches of the Medici Bank could accept the fees of a bishopric, aka the bishop's office. Medici's bank branches were like Renaissance-era WeWork, but instead of being a money vacuum, it was a money magnet. Helping bishops pay their church dues through a Medi Bank meant the Medi Bank was helping the church grow because it was a more secure, streamlined process. The Papal States had already been ruling for centuries, however, strengthening their finances and influence made Cosimo a strong ally. Soon, the Medi Bank was the official bank of the papacy. This kind of backing is the kind of reputation and collateral that money can't buy. Though he wouldn't live long enough to meet his great-grandson, Giovanni di Lorenzo, the fact Giovanni later became Pope Leo X is enough to understand how many seeds of power were planted by Cosimo. What started as having an employee introduce him to a client ended up with his bloodline running the show. But Cosimo got a taste of ruling long before he died in 1464. Throughout his life, he learned to play politics. In 1415, he married into a noble family with military support. It always helps to have an army you can borrow. He used his fortune to curry favour with politicians of the Republic and won the love of the public through his philanthropy. Naturally, he had to pretend to have no political ambition. Florence was a democracy after all. Everyone knows that democracy is run by the people, not shadowy rich elites pulling strings behind closed doors. But while he was making friends and allies, he was also making enemies. Other merchant families had been watching how powerful the Medici were becoming. Though they too had been making backdoor deals and splashing out on public projects, there was no denying that the rise of the Medici was something to be reckoned with. The Albazzi family had been controlling most of Florence's government when the Medici were just another banker on the corner. So they were shocked to see the Medici financial empire spreading across Europe. But beating Cosimo wasn't going to be easy. He was protected by an intricate network of politics, religion, and money. That might seem obvious in our time, when rich bankers and businessmen are always seen rubbing elbows with the elites, but during the 1400s, Cosimo's rise to the top was radical. The Medici were upending everything. Not just how the system worked in Florence, but how the system worked in all of Renaissance Europe. Never before had someone bought their way to the top, let alone into noble circles and public admiration. Anyone who wasn't in Cosimo's good books or payroll had good reason to be paranoid. But after a war broke out with Milan, the Albazzi had the perfect opportunity to pin it all on Cosimo. The Duchy of Milan had been a bit of a thorn in the side of Florence for a long time. So the Albazzi family blamed Cosimo for starting the war and even accused him of trying to overthrow the government of Florence. They struck while the iron was hot by consolidating their power and arresting him. But instead of being executed, Cosimo was sentenced to exile in October 1433. The only city that wasn't hostile to the Medici family was Venice, so Cosimo hid there where he was celebrated like a king. However, he maintained strong connections with his supporters back in Florence. The Albazzi were back running the city but were being undermined by Cosimo's influence. But soon, the public wanted Cosimo back. Some records say it was because the war with Milan was still ongoing, and others say there was an economic slump. Either way, somehow Cosimo returned. Where money and politics had failed, public adoration had saved the day. 1 year later, Cosimo's supporters staged a peaceful coup to force out the Albazzi. His exile was revoked. He returned to Florence and, ironically enough, established himself as the de facto leader and proceeded to exile the Albazzi and their supporters. The Medici name was now tied to Florence's system without needing to take an official title. When Cosimo did kick the bucket, his sons Piero and Giovanni, and Piero's sons Lorenzo and Giuliano, were continuing the project. But it wasn't long until new enemies would emerge with a better plan to test the strength of the Medici brand. In 1478, a group got together in what is known as the Pazzi Conspiracy. The name comes from the Pazzi family, a once prominent banking family who lost key financial and political institutions to the Medici. This ignited a fierce rivalry. But a head-on attack was too risky. Fortunately for the Pazzi family, the Medici had fallen out of favour with the Vatican. Pope Sixtus IV had become frustrated with the Medici's way of doing things. Basically, the Pope was born into a poor family, so he used his tenure as Pope to elevate his relatives. He gave them wealth and positions in the church to do for his bloodline what Cosimo had done for the Medici bloodline. One day he tried to create a new papal state in the small town of Imola. This town was on a key trade route between Florence and Venice, which meant it was valuable for controlling commerce. Unfortunately, Lorenzo had already made a deal to buy the town from the Duke, so the Pope proposed a new deal to the Duke. Give the Pope a discount and he will let the Duke's illegitimate daughter marry one of the Pope's nephews. The irony is, the Pope still needed the Medici to finance this deal, so when Lorenzo found out this plan to undercut him, he refused to back it. Aside from the insult of having to finance a cheaper deal for someone else on something you want, he probably was concerned about this territory being exploited as a chokehold. Tensions rose. The Medici were removed from their duties as the papacy's bankers, which carried with it devastating political repercussions all across Italy. Losing this endorsement damaged their reputation and standing. However, it didn't threaten their power. The Medici were still calling the shots in Florence, so the Pope and the Papacy teamed up when their grievances against the Medici intersected. You see, both parties had wanted someone they knew to become the Archbishop of Florence when the vacancy opened up, but Lorenzo snapped up the position for his own brother-in-law. So, to get their own back, the Pope and the Papacy got their friend the job of Archbishop of Pisa, despite the wishes of the Florence government and the Medici. Maybe this all sounds like high school politics or infighting in a homeowners association, but just know that this was enough for the Vatican and the Papacy to plan an assassination. They got together at the villa of Jacopo de' Pazzi, the head of the family. Although technically the Pope wasn't involved. At another meeting, he said he can't condone violence, but he also said he'd be fine with the Medici being removed, and that he would reward those who did so with kindness. On April 26, 1478, the heads of the Medici family, Lorenzo and Giuliano, were ambushed after High Mass. Taking them out together was vital to guarantee a swift transition of government. Giuliano was stabbed multiple times and died at the scene, but Lorenzo managed to escape with only minor injuries. As you can imagine, things didn't look good for the Pazzis. Supporters of Lorenzo rounded up the plotters for a swift execution. 30 were killed on the day of the attack, mostly through hanging. However, it can't be known if every co-conspirator was caught. Chances are, plenty of innocent people were dragged to the gallows so that the Medici could be sure they were safe. The head of the Pazzi family had managed to hide out in another town for a while, but eventually was recognised and apprehended. His demise signalled the end of the Pazzi family once and for all. As for the Medici, they managed to last a few more centuries. Lorenzo's son Piero took over, but a bad deal with King Charles VII to avoid war saw him chased out by the residents of Florence, who felt he had humiliated the people. This new Republic of Florence preached against the Medici's ways, but 2 decades later, in 1512, and with the support of Pope Julius II, the Medici re-established control. That lasted until 1527, when Florence chased out the Medici once again, but in 1530 the Medici returned to save the city from imperial forces. So from hero to villain to hero to villain to hero to villain, until finally in 1737 the Medici family lost their power when the last ruler in the bloodline passed away. Not that it would have mattered if he'd had a strong line to take over for him. Europe had changed, but the Medici family had not. The age of discovery had come and gone. The bankers and traders of yore were outmatched and outgunned by state-sponsored merchant monopolies. The Medici may have gotten ahead in the early days, but now everyone was playing by their rulebook. Back channels of power, trade, banking, public image, philanthropy. There isn't a power broker today who isn't using the tools they created. Look at the Koch brothers, Rockefellers, Trumps. They might not be European nobility, but they're certainly treated like royalty. As for their fortunes, they'll certainly outlive their names. Once your wealth is tied up in your country's art, culture, architecture, political system, financial institutions, and religion, your net worth is priceless. But can we use the Medici rulebook forever, or will citizens rise up once again? If you liked this video, check out our one on China's first billionaires to see how extremely old money can become new money. And subscribe to keep learning how history works.